whispers in the dark, shuffling boots, a knock at midnight that could change your life in the 1600s. Sleep didn't come easy not when fear crackled through every village wall and candlelight cast shadows of suspicion. Tonight, we quietly drift into the uneasy nights of a world gripped by paranoia, where even dreams weren't safe, and a sleepless yawn could be mistaken for a curse, if slow. Haunting journeys into forgotten corners of history help you rest. You've found your sanctuary. Subscribe now and tap the bell icon to keep exploring the darker edges of the past softly, peacefully, and one night at a time. Before we continue, I'd love to know where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? It's always amazing to see how far our quiet little stories are reaching. The Sleepless Vigiloo. Find yourself in Salem Village, Massachusetts, in the autumn of 1692. Standing before a structure that would forever change your understanding of human suffering. The Salem Jail, a modest two-story building constructed of weathered wooden planks and reinforced with iron, sits near the North River, where the tide brings both the salt air of the Atlantic and the peculiar dampness that seeps through stone foundations. This building, described by one visiting Englishman as existing in the suburbs of hell, houses nearly 150 souls accused of practicing witchcraft. The morning light filters weakly through the narrow windows, casting long shadows across the cramped quarters where accused witches spend their days and nights. Here, in this place where sleep becomes both a necessity and a luxury, you witness the mundane yet profound reality of how rest was pursued, interrupted, and ultimately transformed by the circumstances of witch trials. Consider the sleeping arrangements that defined daily existence for these prisoners. The small cells contained no bedding whatsoever, forcing the accused to rest directly upon floors constructed of rough-hewn planks or packed earth. Those who could afford to purchase straw bedding from their jailers might create a thin barrier between their bodies and the cold ground, but this comfort came at a price that many could not pay. The jail's ledger books, maintained with meticulous care, recorded every single item provided to prisoners, including these meager handfuls of straw that represented the difference between sleeping on bare wood and having the slightest cushion against the unforgiving surface beneath. The physical constraints of the jail determined not only where prisoners slept, but how they slept. Those unable to afford the fees for larger cells found themselves confined in spaces described as coffin-like cells, smaller than a phone booth, in which they could only stand. Imagine spending not just days, but months in such a space where the very concept of lying down to sleep became impossible. These prisoners would lean against the walls, their bodies pressed against the rough wooden surfaces, seeking whatever position might allow them a few minutes of rest while remaining upright. For those fortunate enough to secure space in the larger common areas, sleep became a communal experience defined by the sounds, smells, and movements of dozens of other prisoners. The accused witches of Salem found themselves sharing their sleeping space with people from across the social spectrum, from Bridget Bishop, the tavern keeper known for her defiant spirit, to elderly Rebecca Nurse, whose pious reputation had not protected her from accusation. Each night, these individuals would arrange themselves across the available floor space, their bodies forming a patchwork of humanity, seeking rest in circumstances that seemed designed to prevent it. The physical discomforts that accompanied sleep in the Salem jail extended far beyond the absence of proper bedding. The building's construction, typical of colonial architecture, provided little insulation against the New England climate. During the harsh winter months of 1692 and 1693, the jail's interior temperature would plummet, forcing prisoners to huddle together for warmth. The wooden walls, chinked with whatever materials were available, allowed cold air to seep through gaps and cracks, creating drafts that would wake sleepers throughout the night. Conversely, the summer months brought their own challenges to achieving restful sleep. The cramped quarters, filled with far more people than the space was designed to accommodate, became stifling hot. The lack of adequate ventilation meant that the air grew thick and stale, heavy with the breath of too many people confined in too small a space. The humidity from the nearby river, combined with the warmth generated by so many bodies, created an environment where sleep became fitful and interrupted. The presence of vermin added another layer of discomfort to the sleeping experience. Rats, drawn by the scraps of food that prisoners managed to obtain, would scurry across the floor throughout the night, their small claws clicking against the wooden planks. These creatures, emboldened by the darkness and the relative stillness of sleeping prisoners, would occasionally venture close enough to nibble at clothing or even exposed skin. The lice infestation mentioned in contemporary accounts as a constant presence in the jail meant that prisoners would wake frequently to scratch at their irritated skin, their sleep fragmented by the persistent itching that accompanied these parasites. The sounds of the jail created a unique nighttime symphony that would become familiar to every prisoner. The creaking of the wooden structure as it settled, the distant sound of the rivers tied against the nearby banks, the occasional cry or moan from a fellow prisoner experiencing a nightmare or physical discomfort. These sounds formed the backdrop against which the accused witches attempted to find rest. The guards, who maintained their watch throughout the night, would occasionally walk through the sleeping areas, their footsteps echoing in the confined space, sometimes pausing to check on particular prisoners or to investigate any unusual sounds. The psychological impact of sleeping in such conditions cannot be overlooked. For many of the accused, the jail represented their first extended time away from their own beds, their own homes, their own families. The simple act of lying down to sleep, which had been routine and unremarkable in their previous lives, became a nightly reminder of their changed circumstances. The familiar comfort of their own mattresses, however modest, was replaced by the harsh reality of sleeping on floors that offered no accommodation to the natural curves of the human body. Sleep, in this environment, became both an escape and a trap. Some prisoners found that exhaustion would eventually overtake them, providing temporary relief from the constant anxiety and fear that accompanied their waking hours. Others discovered that sleep brought its own torments, nightmares filled with images of the gallows, dreams of home and family that would dissolve upon waking, or the disorienting experience of awakening in darkness. Temporarily forgetting where they were before the harsh reality of their situation reasserted itself. The rhythm of sleep in the Salem jail was dictated not by natural cycles of light and darkness, but by the arbitrary schedule imposed by their captors. Prisoners might be awakened at any hour for questioning, for medical examinations, or simply because a guard decided to conduct a check of the cells. The uncertainty of when sleep might be interrupted added another layer of stress to an already difficult situation as prisoners learned to sleep lightly, always partially alert to the possibility that their rest might be suddenly ended. As you contemplate the sleeping arrangements in the Salem jail, you begin to understand how the most basic human need for rest became entangled with the larger machinery of witch trials. The conditions that prevented adequate sleep were not merely the result of poor planning or limited resources. They were part of a system that sought to break down the accused through constant discomfort and deprivation. Yet within this system, the human need for sleep persisted, forcing prisoners to find whatever rest they could, under circumstances that seemed designed to prevent it. What emerges from this examination of sleep in the Salem jail is not simply a catalog of discomforts, but a window into how human beings adapt to extreme circumstances. The accused witches of Salem, forced to sleep on floors without bedding, surrounded by strangers, constantly threatened by the possibility of execution, still found ways to rest. They shared warmth with fellow prisoners, created makeshift pillows from folded clothing, and developed the ability to sleep despite the noise and discomfort that surrounded them. In doing so, they demonstrated the resilience of the human spirit even in the darkest of circumstances. But how did these conditions, these sleepless nights filled with discomfort and fear, affect the minds and bodies of the accused? What happened when sleep deprivation became not just a consequence of poor jail conditions, but a deliberate tool used by those seeking confessions? The deeper you venture into the Salem jail, the more apparent it becomes that the building's architecture was designed with purposes beyond mere containment. The dungeon, located at the jail's lowest level, existed in a realm of perpetual darkness that transformed the experience of sleep into something altogether different from what prisoners in the upper levels endured. Here, in chambers carved from the earth and reinforced with stone, the accused witches encountered conditions that challenged the very possibility of distinguishing between day and night, between sleep and waking consciousness. The absence of natural light in the dungeon created a disorienting environment where the body's natural rhythms became confused and unreliable. Without the sun's progression across the sky to mark the passage of time, prisoners found themselves sleeping and waking at irregular intervals, their internal clocks gradually becoming synchronized, not with the natural world, but with the arbitrary schedules imposed by their captors. The darkness was so complete that prisoners would sometimes sleep with their eyes open, unaware that they had transitioned from consciousness to unconsciousness, until they were suddenly awakened by a sound or movement. Water presented another challenge to sleep in the dungeon. The jail's proximity to the North River meant that during high tide, water would seep through the foundations, gradually rising until it reached the prisoners' ankles. This tidal intrusion occurred twice daily, creating a rhythm that had nothing to do with human needs or comfort. Prisoners would be awakened by the cold water spreading across the floor, forcing them to stand or crouch in uncomfortable positions until the tide receded. The dampness would linger long after the water had drained away, creating an environment where dry sleep became impossible. The psychological impact of sleeping in such conditions extended far beyond physical discomfort. The complete darkness of the dungeon meant that prisoners could not see their fellow captives, could not gauge the expressions on their faces, could not derive comfort from visual contact with other human beings. Sleep became a solitary experience, even when shared with others, as each person retreated into their own private world of rest and dreams. The sounds of breathing, shifting, and occasional whispers took on exaggerated importance in this environment where sight provided no information. Those prisoners who were bound with cords and irons faced additional challenges in finding restful sleep. The restraints, applied for months at a time, prevented natural movement and positioning that would normally accompany sleep. Prisoners would wake with numbness in their extremities, with cramped muscles, and with sores where the restraints had rubbed against their skin during the night. The constant pressure and constriction meant that deep sleep became nearly impossible, as discomfort would regularly surface into consciousness, fragmenting rest into brief intervals of fitful dozing. The feeding schedule in the jail was irregular and unpredictable, adding another variable to the already complex relationship between the prisoners and their sleep. Food was provided only to those who could pay for it, and even then, the quantity and quality were minimal. Hunger became a constant companion, creating physical discomfort that interfered with sleep while simultaneously causing a weakness that made extended periods of consciousness difficult to maintain. Some prisoners found that they could escape the gnawing sensation of hunger by sleeping, while others discovered that an empty stomach made sleep impossible. The practice of withholding water from prisoners, employed by authorities who believed that thirst would encourage confessions, created particularly severe disruptions to sleep patterns. Dehydration produces a cascade of physiological effects that include increased heart rate, elevated body temperature, and heightened anxiety, all conditions that make restful sleep difficult to achieve. Prisoners would lie awake, their mouths dry, their thoughts focused on water rather than rest. Their bodies unable to settle into the relaxed state necessary for sleep. The social dynamics of the jail added another layer of complexity to the sleeping experience. Despite the terrible conditions, or perhaps because of them, the Salem jail had become what one contemporary observer described as a social gathering place. Visitors would come to see the accused witches, sometimes bringing alcohol that they purchased from the jail staff. These visits, while providing some relief from the isolation and despair of imprisonment, also disrupted the already fragile sleep patterns of the prisoners. The sound of conversation, laughter, or weeping from visitors would carry through the jail's confined spaces, waking those who had managed to find rest. The possibility of temporary release added another dimension to the sleeping experience of Salem's accused witches. For the sum of £1, a prisoner could secure a day's release to visit family, with the requirement that they return to the jail by nightfall. This opportunity, available only to those with sufficient resources, created a psychological tension that affected sleep patterns. Prisoners would lie awake planning their brief return to the outside world, or would struggle to sleep after returning from such visits. Their minds filled with memories of home and family that made the reality of their jail cell seem even more harsh by comparison. The constant threat of examination and interrogation meant that sleep in the Salem jail was never truly peaceful. Prisoners never knew when they might be awakened for questioning, for medical examination, or for the humiliating process of being searched for witches' marks. The uncertainty created a state of hypervigilance that persisted even during sleep. As prisoners remained partially alert to the possibility of sudden interruption, this chronic state of alertness prevented the deep, restorative sleep that the human body and mind require for proper functioning. The sounds of distress from fellow prisoners created another obstacle to restful sleep. The confined quarters meant that every cry, every sob, every prayer or plea was audible to the other prisoners. Some of the accused suffered from illness or injury that caused them to moan or cry out during the night, while others experienced nightmares or periods of delirium that would wake their fellow prisoners. The empathy and fear that these sounds generated created emotional turmoil that made sleep difficult, as prisoners lay awake wondering if they would be next to suffer whatever affliction had befallen their companions. The financial exploitation that permeated every aspect of jail life extended to sleep itself. Prisoners were charged not only for straw bedding and food, but also for the space they occupied, the restraints they wore, and even for the examinations they were forced to undergo. The constant accumulation of debt created a source of anxiety that followed prisoners into their dreams, as they worried about their ability to pay these mounting costs and the consequences of their inability to do so. As winter deepened and the conditions in the jail became even more harsh, the relationship between the accused witches and their sleep became increasingly strained. The cold made it difficult to fall asleep, while the dampness created an environment where clothes never fully dried in warmth, never fully returned to bodies chilled by the stone floors and drafty walls. Prisoners would huddle together for warmth, sharing body heat in an attempt to create conditions that might allow for rest. But even these efforts were often inadequate. Against the relentless cold, the psychological toll of sleeping in such conditions began to manifest in various ways. Some prisoners reported difficulty distinguishing between dreams and reality, their minds struggling to process the constant stress and deprivation. Others found that they could no longer sleep for extended periods, their bodies having adapted to the frequent interruptions and discomforts by developing patterns of brief, light sleep that could be quickly interrupted without causing the disorientation that typically accompanies waking from deep sleep. The accumulation of sleep debt, the physiological consequence of inadequate rest over extended periods, began to affect the accused witch's ability to think clearly, to respond coherently to questions, and to maintain their emotional equilibrium. This deterioration in mental function would prove significant when prisoners were subjected to interrogation, as their compromised state made them more susceptible to suggestion and more likely to provide the confessions that their captors sought. Yet, even in these conditions, the human need for sleep persisted, asserting itself despite the obstacles and discomforts that surrounded it. The accused witches of Salem adapted to their circumstances, developing techniques for finding rest in seemingly impossible conditions. They learned to sleep sitting up, to ignore the presence of vermin, to find comfort in the warmth of fellow prisoners, and to create mental escapes that allowed them to transcend, if only temporarily, the harsh reality of their physical surroundings. But what happened when sleep deprivation became not merely a consequence of poor conditions, but a deliberate tool of interrogation? How did the systematic denial of rest transform the relationship between the accused and their captors, and what role did this play in the broader machinery of witch trials? The transformation of sleep from a basic human necessity into a weapon of interrogation marks one of the most disturbing aspects of witch trials in the 1600s. As you move beyond the general conditions of imprisonment, you encounter the deliberate use of sleep deprivation as a method of extracting confessions from accused witches. This practice, employed across Europe and later in colonial America, reveals how the most fundamental human need for rest became entangled with the legal machinery designed to prove guilt and secure punishment. The technique known as watching represented the systematic application of sleep deprivation as a tool of interrogation. Unlike the general discomfort of jail conditions, watching was a precisely controlled method that involved keeping accused witches perpetually awake for days on end. The procedure was designed to be deniable. It left no physical marks and could be presented as mere observation rather than torture, allowing authorities to maintain the fiction that they were not violating laws against cruel treatment of prisoners. The process of watching typically began with the accused being placed in a specific room or cell where they could be continuously observed by guards working in shifts. The guards, whose duty was to ensure that the prisoner never fell asleep, would use various methods to maintain wakefulness. Some would engage the prisoner in conversation, asking questions about their alleged activities or pressing them for prosectes. Are prosecteurs, or pressing them for pressicating my malaise. Whose dory malaise, whose nasus who breuds, whose mum to made, while we do we. We see come made to make, we deprise. We made be make to make. It was be wis a made, we make bad, by we may made be lie to make. We sound it, by sad a canad for sud of unlie it. Get it to se read to seek se go I to se me you did to I lists it's a gigabit to we does it to we did to sit a guy to sit it to glass did to be to sit stick to details about their supposed crimes. Others would use physical methods, poking the prisoner with sticks, making sudden loud noises, or forcing them to walk around the cell whenever they showed signs of drowsiness. The psychological impact of being watched continuously while being denied sleep created a unique form of torment that went beyond simple physical discomfort. The prisoner, already vulnerable due to their circumstances, found themselves under constant scrutiny, unable to retreat into the privacy that sleep normally provides. Every gesture, every word, every expression was observed and potentially recorded, creating a sense of exposure that persisted even during periods of extreme exhaustion. The duration of watching sessions varied depending on the authorities' assessment of the prisoner's resistance and the urgency of obtaining a confession. Some prisoners were subjected to this treatment for 3 or 4 days, while others endured it for a week or longer. The effects of prolonged sleep deprivation became increasingly severe as the days passed, with prisoners experiencing hallucinations, confusion, and a progressive breakdown of their ability to distinguish between reality and imagination. The hallucinations that accompanied extended sleep deprivation often took forms that seemed to confirm the very accusations being made against the prisoners. Exhausted and disoriented, some accused witches would report seeing devils or demons in their cells, or would describe conversations with supernatural beings. These reports, rather than being recognized as symptoms of sleep deprivation, were often interpreted as evidence of the prisoner's guilt, creating a circular logic that used the effects of torture to justify the torture itself. The physical effects of prolonged wakefulness compounded the psychological torment. The human body, deprived of the restorative functions that occur during sleep, begins to break down in predictable ways. Motor coordination deteriorates, making simple movements clumsy and uncertain. The immune system weakens, leaving the body vulnerable to illness. The digestive system becomes disrupted, causing nausea and loss of appetite. All of these physical symptoms contributed to the overall debilitation of the prisoner, making resistance to interrogation increasingly difficult. The interrogators who employed watching techniques understood that the breakdown of the prisoner's mental defenses was a gradual process that required patience and persistence. They would typically begin their questioning when the prisoner was still relatively alert, establishing a baseline of the accused responses and demeanor. As the hours without sleep accumulated, the interrogators would return repeatedly, noting changes in the prisoner's coherence, emotional state, and willingness to cooperate. The questions asked during these sessions were carefully crafted to take advantage of the prisoner's deteriorating mental state, rather than simply demanding a confession. Interrogators would often begin with seemingly innocuous questions about the prisoner's daily activities, their relationships with neighbors, their knowledge of local folklore or healing practices. As the prisoner's defenses weakened, these questions would gradually become more leading, suggesting specific details about alleged crimes or prompting the prisoner to confirm particular aspects of the accusations against them. The social isolation that accompanied watching sessions added another dimension to the psychological pressure. Prisoners subjected to this treatment were typically separated from other accused witches, denied the comfort and solidarity that might be found in shared experience. The guards who maintained the watch were instructed to remain detached and professional, offering no sympathy or human connection that might provide emotional support to the prisoner. This isolation, combined with the constant observation and sleep deprivation, created a sense of being completely alone in the world, abandoned by both human and divine support, the religious context of which trials added a particularly cruel dimension to the use of sleep deprivation. Many of the accused were devout Christians who found comfort in prayer and religious observance, but the watching process was designed to interfere with these spiritual practices. Exhausted prisoners might find themselves unable to concentrate on prayers or might experience religious hallucinations that could be interpreted as evidence of their corruption by evil forces. The inability to maintain their usual spiritual practices added spiritual distress to the physical and psychological torment they were already experiencing. The economic aspects of watching sessions reveal another layer of the systematic nature of this practice. The guards who maintained the watch were paid for their services, creating a financial incentive to prolong the process. The costs of these extended interrogations were often charged to the prisoner or their family, adding financial pressure to the other forms of coercion being applied. This economic dimension meant that the suffering of the accused became a source of profit for those conducting the trials, creating perverse incentives that encouraged the use of more extreme methods. The documentation of watching sessions when it occurred typically focused on the prisoner's statements and confessions rather than the methods used to obtain them. Court records might note that a prisoner had been examined or questioned over a period of days, but they rarely described the specific techniques employed or the conditions under which the prisoner was held. This selective documentation allowed authorities to maintain the legal fiction that confessions were obtained through legitimate means, while concealing the coercive methods that had actually been used, the confessions obtained through watching. Sessions often shared certain characteristics that reflected the deteriorated mental state of the prisoners who made them. These statements frequently included bizarre or fantastic details that seemed to confirm the most extreme beliefs about witchcraft, stories of flying through the air, transforming into animals, or participating in elaborate rituals with the devil. Rather than being recognized as the products of sleep-deprived minds, these confessions were often accepted as evidence of the reality of the supernatural crimes being investigated. The aftermath of watching sessions could be as traumatic as the experience itself. Prisoners who eventually confessed under these conditions often experienced profound guilt and confusion about their statements, unsure whether what they had said was true or false. The psychological impact of having been broken down so completely could persist long after the immediate physical effects of sleep deprivation had passed, leaving lasting trauma that affected the prisoner's sense of self and reality. The effectiveness of watching as a method of obtaining confessions made it a popular tool among witch hunters throughout Europe and colonial America. The technique's apparent legality, it involved no physical violence and left no permanent marks, made it attractive to authorities who needed to maintain the appearance of following proper legal procedures. The fact that it was highly effective in breaking down prisoner resistance ensured its continued use throughout the period of witch trials. The use of sleep deprivation as a tool of interrogation during witch trials represents one of the most systematic applications of psychological torture in the early modern period. The practice reveals how the fundamental human need for sleep could be weaponized by those in power, transforming a basic biological necessity into a means of control and coercion. The prisoners who endured these sessions faced not just the denial of rest, but the complete breakdown of their mental and physical defenses, leaving them vulnerable to manipulation and false confession. As you contemplate the role of sleep deprivation in witch trials, you begin to understand how the denial of rest became part of a larger system of oppression and control. The watching sessions were not simply crude attempts to extract confessions through suffering, but carefully orchestrated psychological operations designed to break down the prisoner's sense of reality and resistance. In doing so, they reveal the sophisticated understanding that early modern authorities had of the relationship between sleep, consciousness, and human vulnerability. But how did these practices affect not just the accused witches themselves, but the broader communities in which witch trials took place? What happened when the fear of witchcraft began to disrupt the sleep of entire villages, transforming the nighttime from a period of rest into a time of anxiety and terror? You stand in the countryside of early 17th century England, where the rolling hills and quiet villages provide a deceptive backdrop for one of the most systematic campaigns of terror in British history. Here, between 1644 and 1646, a man named Matthew Hopkins would earn the self-proclaimed title of Witchfinder General. Through his ruthless application of sleep deprivation as a weapon against those he accused of witchcraft, his methods, refined through practice and justified through twisted logic, would demonstrate how the denial of rest could be transformed into a precise instrument of psychological torture. The technique that Hopkins perfected was known as walking the witch, a procedure that combined forced physical activity with complete sleep deprivation over periods of several days. Unlike the passive watching employed in other regions, walking the witch required the accused to remain in constant motion, preventing rest through continuous physical exertion. The accused would be forced to walk back and forth across a room or courtyard, with guards working in shifts to ensure that the walking never stopped, day or night. The guards who participated in these sessions were carefully selected and trained in the specific techniques required to maintain the procedure effectively. They worked in rotating shifts, allowing them to remain alert and attentive while the prisoner they were watching gradually deteriorated under the combined effects of exhaustion, sleep deprivation, and continuous physical stress. The guards were instructed to prevent the prisoner from sitting, leaning against walls, or pausing for more than a few seconds at a time. Any attempt to rest, even momentarily, would be met with verbal commands or physical prodding to resume walking. The psychological impact of walking the witch extended far beyond the physical exhaustion it produced. The constant motion prevented the accused from achieving the mental focus necessary for prayer, meditation, or even coherent thought. The repetitive nature of the walking back and forth across the same limited space created a hypnotic effect that further disoriented the prisoner's mental state. As hours turned to days, the simple act of walking became an overwhelming burden that consumed all of the prisoner's attention and energy. The duration of walking sessions was carefully calibrated to achieve maximum psychological impact while maintaining the fiction that the procedure was merely an extended form of questioning. Hopkins and his associates had learned through experience that most prisoners would begin to show signs of serious mental deterioration after 2 or 3 days of continuous walking, with complete psychological breakdown typically occurring within a week. The timing was crucial. Too short a period might not produce the desired confession, while too long a period risked the prisoner's death, which would eliminate the possibility of a public trial and execution. The physical effects of prolonged walking combined with sleep deprivation created a cascade of physiological changes that gradually broke down the prisoner's resistance. The feet and legs, subjected to constant pressure and movement, would develop blisters, swelling, and eventually open sores. The cardiovascular system, stressed by the continuous exertion and lack of rest, would become increasingly inefficient, leading to rapid heartbeat, shortness of breath, and episodes of dizziness or fainting. The digestive system, disrupted by the stress and irregular eating patterns, would cease to function normally, causing nausea, loss of appetite, and eventual malnutrition. The hallucinations that accompanied extended walking sessions were often the first sign that the prisoner's mental defenses were beginning to collapse. After several days without sleep, combined with the disorienting effects of continuous motion, accused witches would begin to report seeing things that were not there, devils appearing in the corners of the room, deceased relatives offering guidance or warnings, or supernatural creatures that seemed to be encouraging them to confess. These visions, rather than being recognized as symptoms of severe sleep deprivation, were often interpreted by Hopkins and his associates as evidence of the prisoner's guilt. The interrogation techniques employed during walking sessions were designed to take advantage of the prisoner's deteriorating mental state. Rather than asking direct questions about witchcraft, Hopkins would often begin with seemingly innocent inquiries about the prisoner's daily activities, their relationships with neighbors, or their knowledge of local folklore. As the prisoner's defenses weakened, these questions would gradually become more leading, suggesting specific details about alleged crimes or prompting the prisoner to confirm particular aspects of the accusations against them. The social dynamics of walking sessions added another layer of psychological pressure to the procedure. The accused witch, isolated from family and friends, found themselves completely dependent on their captors for basic necessities like food and water. The guards who maintained the walking routine held complete power over the prisoner's immediate environment, controlling not only their physical movements, but also their access to relief from the constant discomfort. This power dynamic created a relationship of complete dependence that made resistance increasingly difficult as the days passed. The religious context of Hopkins' methods added a particularly cruel dimension to the walking procedure. Many of the accused were devout Christians who found comfort in prayer and religious observance. But the constant walking made it impossible to maintain these spiritual practices. The inability to kneel for prayer, to sit quietly for meditation, or to focus on religious texts created spiritual distress that compounded the physical and psychological torment already being experienced. Some prisoners reported that their inability to maintain their usual religious practices made them feel abandoned by God, adding despair to the exhaustion and pain they were already enduring. The economic aspects of Hopkins' operations revealed the systematic nature of his approach to witch hunting. The Witchfinder General and his associates were paid for their services by the communities that hired them, creating a financial incentive to find witches and obtain confessions. The costs of the walking sessions, including payment for the walk's gear, Nial, Milli, Mias, only Ruby Kiss has the luxurious texture that glides on smoothly. And leave was an evilly save call/testabood, creating a financial incentive to play/case. Meow callasting, Malai says, with a lass. Meow, with laste/eclat. Meow, we alive, my menet, by Sikasab, we alas it, capri to we subid. I could walk at Sagalar with a conwal that said, I see wheelie skates of it, I sa I screet you si me lut 6 tickets kablit and I dice tickets with a guy I sits to this Guards' provision of minimal food and water and the use of facilities were often charged to the prisoner's family, adding financial pressure to the other forms of coercion being applied. This economic dimension meant that the suffering of the accused became a source of profit for those conducting the trials. The documentation of walking sessions, when it occurred, typically focused on the prisoner's eventual confession rather than the methods used to obtain it. Court records might note that a prisoner had been examined or questioned over a period of days, but they rarely described the specific techniques employed or the conditions under which the prisoner was held. This selective documentation allowed Hopkins and his associates to maintain the legal fiction that confessions were obtained through legitimate means, while concealing the coercive methods that had actually been used. The confessions obtained through pews, he, and leaves a rich, long-lasting color. My lasting course, my last my last is. My last is lest. YQC, my Y, well key. Y slee seed. I case up. CC, KC, we cade C dot sit. Grab play to be sakoi sid. Dot well rai wide. The sawai da wally. I decide BK to let it to masoki to with unslats. Kasika kit to blind. I take a dit to like I did to stit to by big leak. This the way these kind of match that does this walking sessions often shared certain characteristics that reflected the deteriorated mental state of the prisoners who made them. These statements frequently included bizarre or fantastic details that seemed to confirm the most extreme beliefs about witchcraft, stories of flying through the air, transforming into animals, or participating in elaborate rituals with the devil rather than being recognized as the products of sleep-deprived and exhausted minds. These confessions were often accepted as evidence of the reality of the supernatural crimes being investigated. The aftermath of walking sessions could be as traumatic as the experience itself. Prisoners who eventually confessed under these conditions often experienced profound guilt and confusion about their statements, unsure whether what they had said was true or false. The physical recovery from days of continuous walking could take weeks or months, with some prisoners suffering permanent damage to their feet, legs, or cardiovascular system. The psychological impact of having been broken down so completely could persist long after the immediate physical effects had passed, leaving lasting trauma that affected the prisoner's sense of self and reality. The effectiveness of walking as A method of obtaining confessions made it a popular tool among witch hunters throughout England during Hopkins' reign of terror. The technique's apparent legality, it involved no direct physical violence and could be presented as merely an extended form of questioning, made it attractive to authorities who needed to maintain the appearance of following proper legal procedures. The fact that it was highly effective in breaking down prisoner resistance ensured its continued use throughout Hopkins' campaigns. The success of Hopkins' methods led to their adoption by other witch hunters, creating a network of practitioners who shared techniques and experiences. The walking procedure became standardized, with specific protocols for guard rotation, prisoner monitoring, and interrogation techniques. This systematization transformed what might have been crude torture into a refined method of psychological manipulation that could be applied consistently across different cases and locations. The impact of Hopkins' walking technique extended beyond the immediate victims to the broader communities in which witch trials took place. The knowledge that such methods were being used created a climate of fear that affected everyone's sense of security and safety. The realization that sleep itself could be weaponized against them made the nighttime hours particularly anxious for those who feared they might be the next to be accused. As you contemplate the walking technique employed by Matthew Hopkins, you begin to understand how the denial of rest became part of a larger system of oppression and control. The procedure was not simply a crude attempt to extract confessions through suffering, but a carefully orchestrated psychological operation designed to break down the prisoner's sense of reality and resistance. In doing so, it reveals the sophisticated understanding that early modern authorities had of the relationship between sleep, consciousness, and human vulnerability. But how did these walking sessions progress from the initial application of the technique to the eventual breakdown of the prisoner's resistance? What was the day-by-day experience of those subjected to this form of torture? And how did their captors monitor and adjust their methods to achieve maximum effectiveness? The progression of a walking session followed a predictable pattern that Hopkins and his associates had refined through months of practice and observation. As you examine the day-by-day breakdown of the prisoner's resistance, you discover how the systematic denial of rest created a precisely calibrated descent into psychological collapse. The first day would typically begin with the prisoner still possessing some degree of defiance and hope. But as the hours passed without relief, this initial resistance would gradually give way to desperation and eventual surrender. The first 12 hours of walking established the basic rhythm that would dominate the prisoner's experience. During this initial period, the accused, which would typically maintain their protestations of innocence while attempting to comply with the demands of their captors. The physical act of walking, while uncomfortable and tiring, was not yet overwhelming. And many prisoners would attempt to use this time to plan their responses to questioning or to pray for divine intervention. The guards, fresh and alert, would maintain strict discipline, ensuring that the prisoner maintained a steady pace without pause or rest. As the first night approached, the psychological impact of the walking procedure would begin to manifest more clearly. The natural circadian rhythms that govern the prisoner's sleep-wake cycle would assert themselves, creating increasing drowsiness and a desperate desire for rest. The guards would watch carefully for signs of fatigue, stumbling, slowed pace, or attempts to lean against walls, and would respond immediately with verbal commands or physical prodding to maintain the walking rhythm. The prisoner would begin to understand that no relief was forthcoming, that the walking would continue regardless of their physical or mental state. The second day marked a crucial transition in the prisoner's experience. By this point, the accumulated effects of sleep deprivation would begin to compromise cognitive function, making it increasingly difficult to maintain coherent thought or rational planning. The physical exhaustion from continuous walking would compound these mental effects, creating a state of profound disorientation that made resistance increasingly difficult. Many prisoners would begin to stumble more frequently, their coordination deteriorating as their nervous system struggled to function without adequate rest. The hallucinations that typically began on the second or third day represented a significant milestone in the breakdown of the prisoner's mental defenses. These visions, caused by the brain's attempt to create dreamlike experiences while remaining conscious, would often take forms that seemed to confirm the accusations being made against the prisoner. Some would report seeing devils or demons encouraging them to confess, while others would describe conversations with deceased relatives or supernatural beings. Hopkins and his associates, rather than recognizing these as symptoms of severe sleep deprivation, would interpret them as evidence of the prisoner's guilt and supernatural connections. The third day typically brought a qualitative change in the prisoner's condition. The continuous stress on the cardiovascular system would begin to produce more serious symptoms: irregular heartbeat, chest pain, and periods of dizziness or fainting. The feet and legs, subjected to constant pressure and movement, would develop serious injuries, including blisters, swelling, and open sores that made each step increasingly painful. The digestive system, disrupted by stress and irregular eating patterns, would cease to function normally, causing nausea and loss of appetite that further weakened the prisoner's physical condition. The guards who maintained the walking sessions were instructed to monitor the prisoner's condition carefully, not out of concern for their welfare, but to ensure that the procedure remained effective. They would watch for signs that the prisoner was approaching complete collapse, adjusting their demands accordingly to maintain the maximum psychological pressure without causing immediate death. This required a delicate balance. Too much pressure might kill the prisoner before a confession could be obtained, while too little might allow them to maintain their resistance. The interrogation techniques employed during walking sessions were carefully timed to take advantage of the prisoner's deteriorating mental state. During the first day, questions would be relatively straightforward, allowing the interrogators to establish a baseline of the prisoner's responses and mental acuity. As the days passed and the prisoner's defenses weakened, the questions would become more leading and suggestive, designed to prompt specific admissions or to confirm particular details about the alleged crimes. The fourth and fifth days, typically, marked the period when most prisoners would begin to show signs of complete psychological breakdown. The combined effects of sleep deprivation, physical exhaustion, and continuous stress would create a state of profound disorientation in which the prisoner might lose the ability to distinguish between reality and hallucination. Some would begin to confess to crimes they had not committed, not out of a desire to lie, but because they had lost the ability to distinguish between their own thoughts and external suggestions. The physical deterioration that accompanied extended walking sessions created additional pressure for confession. The pain from injured feet and legs would become constant and overwhelming, making each step a source of agony. The cardiovascular stress would produce symptoms that many prisoners interpreted as signs of impending death, creating a sense of urgency about making peace with their captors before it was too late. The respiratory difficulties caused by continuous exertion would make even simple speech difficult, forcing prisoners to conserve their energy for the most important communications. The social isolation that accompanied walking sessions added another dimension to the psychological pressure. As a prisoner, cut off from family and friends, found themselves completely dependent on their captors for basic necessities. The guards who maintained the walking routine held complete power over the prisoner's immediate environment, controlling not only their physical movements, but also their access to food, water, and brief moments of reduced intensity. This power dynamic created a relationship of complete dependence that made resistance increasingly difficult as the days passed. The religious implications of the walking procedure created particular anguish for devout prisoners. The inability to kneel for prayer, to sit quietly for meditation, or to focus on religious texts created spiritual distress that compounded the physical and psychological torment already being experienced. Some prisoners reported that their inability to maintain their usual religious practices made them feel abandoned by God, adding despair to the exhaustion and pain they were already enduring. The economic pressure applied to prisoners' families added another layer of coercion to the walking procedure. The costs of maintaining the guards, providing minimal food and water, and using the facilities were often charged to the prisoner's family, creating financial incentives for quick confession. Families faced the terrible choice between allowing their loved one to continue suffering or bankrupting themselves to pay for the continuation of the torture. The documentation of walking sessions reveals the systematic nature of Hopkins' approach. Detailed records were kept of the prisoner's statements, physical condition, and responses to questioning, creating a database of information that could be used to refine the technique and apply it more effectively to future cases. These records, when they survive, provide a chilling glimpse into the methodical application of psychological torture in the service of extracting confessions. The confessions obtained through walking sessions often followed predictable patterns that reflected the deteriorated mental state of the prisoners who made them. These statements frequently included elaborate details about supernatural activities, conversations with devils, and participation in witches' sabbaths, details that seem to confirm the most extreme beliefs about witchcraft held by their captors. The fantastic nature of these confessions, rather than raising questions about their validity, was often seen as evidence of the reality of the supernatural crimes being leaked in. The aftermath of walking sessions could be as traumatic as the experience itself. Prisoners who survived the procedure often suffered permanent physical damage to their feet, legs, and cardiovascular system. The psychological impact of having been broken down so completely could persist for years, affecting their ability to trust others, their sense of personal autonomy, and their relationship with their own memories and perceptions. The effectiveness of the walking technique in obtaining confessions made it a valuable tool in Hopkins' arsenal, but it also created practical problems for the legal system. The confessions obtained through such extreme methods were often so elaborate and fantastic that they stretched the credulity of even the most superstitious judges and juries. The physical condition of prisoners who had endured walking sessions sometimes made it difficult for them to participate effectively in their own trials, creating legal complications that required creative solutions. The success of Hopkins' methods led to their adoption by other witch hunters, creating a network of practitioners who shared techniques and experiences. The walking procedure became standardized, with specific protocols for guard rotation, prisoner monitoring, and interrogation techniques. This systematization transformed what might have been crude torture into a refined method of psychological manipulation that could be applied consistently across different cases and locations. As you contemplate the day-by progression of walking sessions, you begin to understand how the systematic denial of rest created a precisely calibrated instrument of psychological control. The procedure was not simply a matter of keeping prisoners awake, but a complex process of physical, mental, and spiritual breakdown that gradually stripped away their ability to resist. In doing so, it reveals the sophisticated understanding that early modern witch hunters had of human psychology and the relationship between physical stress and mental vulnerability. But what happened to those who endured these sessions? The experience of walking the witch transformed not only the immediate victims, but also the broader understanding of confession, guilt, and the nature of evidence in witch trials. The moment when a prisoner finally broke under the relentless pressure of walking the witch marked both the culmination of Hopkins' method and the beginning of a new phase in the witch trial process. As you witness the collapse of resistance that typically occurred after days of continuous walking and sleep deprivation, you observe how the systematic destruction of a human being's mental defenses created confessions that would reshape the understanding of witchcraft and supernatural crime in early modern England. The actual moment of breakdown often occurred with startling suddenness after days of gradual deterioration. A prisoner who had maintained their innocence through days of walking would suddenly begin speaking rapidly, their words tumbling out in a desperate attempt to end their suffering. The content of these initial confessions typically bore little resemblance to the specific charges that had been brought against them, instead consisting of fragmented admissions that seemed to confirm whatever their captors wanted to hear. The guards who witnessed these moments of collapse were trained to recognize the signs and to immediately summon the interrogators who would shape the prisoner's admissions into a coherent narrative. The timing was crucial. The window of opportunity when the prisoner was broken enough to confess, but still coherent enough to provide useful information, was often brief. Too early, and the confession might be incomplete or easily retracted. Too late, and the prisoner might collapse into complete incoherence or death. The process of transforming a broken prisoner's disjointed admissions into a legal confession required considerable skill and experience. The interrogators would guide the prisoner through a series of leading questions, designed to elicit specific details about their alleged crimes. These questions were carefully crafted to take advantage of the prisoner's deteriorated mental state, suggesting details that the prisoner would then confirm or elaborate upon. The prisoner, desperate to end their suffering and no longer capable of distinguishing between their own thoughts and external suggestions, would often provide whatever details seemed to satisfy their captors. The content of confessions obtained through walking sessions revealed the profound impact of sleep deprivation on human consciousness and memory. Prisoners would describe elaborate supernatural activities that seemed to draw from a combination of popular folklore, religious imagery, and hallucinations induced by their extreme physical and mental state. These confessions often included vivid descriptions of flying through the air, transforming into animals, participating in witches' sabbaths, and engaging in conversations with devils or demons. The level of detail in these confessions was often extraordinary, with prisoners describing the appearance of supernatural beings, the layout of otherworldly locations, and the specific rituals allegedly performed during their supposed crimes. This wealth of detail, rather than raising questions about the validity of the confessions, was often seen as evidence of their authenticity. The assumption was that such elaborate and consistent accounts could only come from direct personal experience, not from the imagination of someone under extreme duress. The psychological mechanisms that produced these detailed confessions were complex and reflected the profound impact of sleep deprivation on memory and perception. The human brain, deprived of the restorative functions that occurred during sleep, begins to create dreamlike experiences while the person remains conscious. These experiences, known as hypnagogic hallucinations, can be extremely vivid and realistic, often incorporating elements from the person's cultural background and immediate environment. The interrogation techniques employed during confession sessions were designed to exploit these psychological vulnerabilities. Interrogators would often begin by asking about the prisoner's hallucinations, treating them as genuine memories rather than symptoms of sleep deprivation. They would then guide the prisoner through a process of elaborating on these memories, adding details and context that would transform isolated visions into coherent narratives of supernatural crime. The religious context of these confessions added another layer of complexity to their interpretation. Many of the prisoners were devout Christians whose confessions included detailed descriptions of interactions with devils and demons. These religious elements were often seen as particularly convincing evidence of the confession's authenticity, as it was assumed that a truly innocent person would not be able to describe such supernatural encounters with such apparent familiarity. The social implications of these confessions extended far beyond the immediate fate of the prisoners who made them. The detailed descriptions of witches, sabbaths, and supernatural activities provided authorities with a template for understanding witchcraft that influenced subsequent investigations and trials. The names of alleged accomplices mentioned in these Confessions led to new arrests and accusations, creating a cascading effect that expanded the scope of witch hunting operations. The legal processing of confessions obtained through walking sessions required careful handling to maintain their validity in court. The extreme methods used to obtain these admissions could not be explicitly acknowledged, as this would undermine their legal standing and potentially expose the authorities to charges of illegal torture. Instead, court records typically describe the confessions as having been obtained through diligent examination or careful questioning over a period of days. The prisoners who had made these confessions often experienced profound confusion and distress about their own statements. In many cases, they would attempt to retract their admissions once they had recovered from the immediate effects of sleep deprivation, claiming that they had been forced to lie or that they could not remember making the statements attributed to them. These retractions were typically dismissed by authorities as evidence of the prisoners' continued connection to supernatural forces that were preventing them from acknowledging their guilt. The families of prisoners who had confessed faced their own form of torment. The detailed nature of the confessions made it difficult for loved ones to dismiss them entirely, even when they knew the circumstances under which they had been obtained. The descriptions of supernatural activities and relationships with evil forces created doubt and fear that could persist long after the immediate crisis had passed. Some families found themselves questioning whether their loved one might actually have been involved in witchcraft, while others struggled with guilt about their inability to prevent the confession or protect their family member from torture. The community impact of these confessions was significant and long-lasting. The detailed descriptions of witches, Sabbaths, and supernatural activities provided a new understanding of how witchcraft operated in local communities. The names of alleged accomplices mentioned in confessions led to new waves of suspicion and accusation, creating a climate of fear and mistrust that could persist for years. The apparent authenticity of the confessions, supported by their wealth of detail and consistency, made them powerful tools for justifying continued witch hunting operations. The economic implications of these confessions were also substantial. The prisoners who had confessed were typically required to pay for the costs of their interrogation, including the salaries of guards, the provision of minimal food and water, and the use of facilities. These costs, combined with the legal fees associated with their trials, could bankrupt families and create long-lasting financial hardship. The economic burden of witch trials became a form of punishment that extended beyond the immediate victims to their entire families and communities. The documentation of these confessions created a body of evidence that would influence witch hunting practices for decades to come. The detailed accounts of supernatural activities provided templates for understanding witchcraft that were applied to subsequent cases. The techniques that had proven effective in obtaining confessions were refined and systematized, creating a body of knowledge that could be shared among witch hunters and applied consistently across different regions and contexts. The psychological legacy of these confessions extended beyond their immediate impact on witch trials. The systematic use of sleep deprivation to extract admissions of guilt created a new understanding of the relationship between physical stress and mental vulnerability. The recognition that extreme fatigue could produce detailed and apparently convincing false confessions had implications that extended far beyond the specific context of witchcraft prosecutions. The moral implications of these confessions raised questions about the nature of truth, guilt, and justice that would persist long after the witch trials themselves had ended. The systematic use of torture to extract admissions of guilt challenged fundamental assumptions about the reliability of confessions and the legitimacy of legal proceedings. The recognition that innocent people could be made to confess to crimes they had not committed had profound implications for legal systems that relied heavily on confessions as evidence of guilt. As you contemplate the broken confessions produced By Walking the Witch, you begin to understand how the systematic denial of rest became part of a larger system of legal and social control. The confessions were not simply the product of crude torture, but the result of sophisticated psychological manipulation that exploited fundamental vulnerabilities in human consciousness and memory. In doing so, it revealed a dangerous potential for abuse that exists when legal systems abandon basic protections for human dignity and rights. The legacy of these confessions would continue to influence witch trials and legal proceedings for generations to come, creating a template for understanding supernatural crime that would persist long after the methods used to obtain them had been forgotten. The detailed accounts of witchcraft activities provided by broken prisoners would shape popular understanding of supernatural forces and their influence on human affairs, creating cultural narratives that would persist in folklore and literature for centuries. But how did the systematic use of sleep deprivation in witch trials affect not just the accused and their immediate families, but entire communities living under the shadow of supernatural suspicion? What happened when the fear of witchcraft began to transform the nighttime hours from a period of rest into a time of vigilance and terror? You find yourself in Salem Village, Massachusetts. During the winter months of 1692, the sun sets earlier each day, and the long nights stretch ahead like dark tunnels filled with uncertainty and fear. The village, once a place where families gathered around hearths and children were tucked safely into beds, has been transformed into a community where sleep itself has become a source of anxiety and suspicion. The witch trials that began in February have created an atmosphere where the normal rhythms of rest and wakefulness have been profoundly disrupted, affecting not just the accused and their families, but every member of the community. The evening hours, traditionally a time for families to gather and prepare for rest, have taken on new significance in the context of the witch trials. Parents who once sent their children to bed with simple prayers and gentle words now find themselves listening anxiously for unusual sounds, watching for signs of supernatural activity, and struggling with their own fears about what might happen during the vulnerable hours of sleep. The knowledge that witches were believed to be most active during the nighttime hours has transformed the period between sunset and sunrise into a time of heightened vigilance and concern. The physical layout of Salem Village, with its scattered farmhouses and isolated homesteads, has made the nighttime hours particularly anxiety-provoking for residents. Unlike more densely populated areas where neighbors live in close proximity, the rural nature of the village means that many families spend their nights in relative isolation, separated from their neighbors by fields, forests, and considerable distances. This isolation, which had previously provided privacy and independence, now creates a sense of vulnerability that affects every aspect of the nighttime experience. The children of Salem Village, who had once looked forward to bedtime as a peaceful conclusion to their daily activities, now approach sleep with a mixture of exhaustion and apprehension. The adult conversations they overhear during the day, discussions of spectral evidence, supernatural attacks, and the identification of witches among their neighbors, infiltrate their dreams and create nightmares that wake them crying and fearful. Parents find themselves spending more time at their children's bedsides, offering comfort and reassurance while struggling with their own doubts about their ability to protect their families from supernatural threats. The servants and apprentices who live in the households of Salem Village face their own unique challenges during the nighttime hours. Many of these young people sleep in attics, cellars, or other isolated parts of the house, spaces that have become associated with supernatural activity in the community's imagination. The case of the Paris household, where the witch trials began with the strange behavior of Tituba, Key, Williams, and Betty Paris. Kay has made other households acutely aware of the potential for supernatural activity to manifest among their own domestic staff. The married couples of Salem Village find that their bedtime conversations have been transformed by the ongoing trials. Discussions that once focused on practical matters like farm work, family finances, and community gossip now revolve around the identification of witches, the interpretation of unusual events, and the assessment of supernatural threats. Husbands and wives lie awake discussing which of their neighbors might be involved in witchcraft, analyzing the behavior of people they have known for years, and questioning their own judgment about the trustworthiness of their community members. The elderly, residents of Salem Village, who had accumulated decades of experience in interpreting the natural world and understanding community dynamics, find their traditional sources of wisdom challenged by the supernatural explanations that have become prevalent. Old women who once served as midwives, healers, and sources of traditional knowledge now find themselves viewed with suspicion, their expertise reinterpreted as potential evidence of supernatural knowledge. The nighttime hours become particularly difficult for these individuals, as they struggle with the realization that their own neighbors might view them as threats. The ministers and religious leaders of Salem Village face their own unique burden during the nighttime hours. The Reverend Samuel Parris, in whose household the witch trials began, finds his nights filled with prayer, study, and agonizing self-examination about his role in the unfolding events. The responsibility of providing spiritual guidance to a community in crisis weighs heavily on these religious leaders, who must balance their duty to protect their congregation from supernatural threats with their obligation to provide comfort and pastoral care. The economic impact of the witch trials has created additional stress that affects the sleep of many Salem Village residents. The disruption of normal community activities, the costs associated with legal proceedings, and the uncertainty about the future have created financial pressures that add to the existing anxiety about supernatural threats. Farmers lie awake worrying about their ability to complete seasonal work when so many community members are involved in legal proceedings. While merchants and craftsmen struggle with the impact of the trials on their business relationships and economic prospects, the physical symptoms of community-wide anxiety have begun to manifest in various ways throughout Salem Village. Many residents report difficulty falling asleep, frequent awakening during the night, and a general sense of exhaustion that persists despite spending adequate time in bed. The chronic stress of living in a community under supernatural suspicion has created a collective state of hypervigilance that interferes with the normal processes of rest and recovery. The documentation of supernatural events has created a new form of nighttime activity in Salem Village. Community members who witness unusual occurrences, strange lights, unexplained sounds, or encounters with spectral figures feel obligated to report these events to the authorities. This has created a culture of surveillance and documentation that extends into the nighttime hours, with residents maintaining heightened awareness of their surroundings and the behavior of their neighbors. The traveling ministers, officials, and curious observers who have come to Salem Village to witness the witch trials have added another element to the community's nighttime experience. These visitors, staying in local homes and inns, bring their own perspectives and anxieties about the supernatural events taking place. Their presence creates additional pressure on local residents to maintain vigilance and to demonstrate their own innocence and piety through their behavior and responses to the ongoing crisis. The seasonal cycle of winter in New England has intensified. The impact of the witch trials on community sleep patterns. The long nights, which begin in mid-afternoon and extend well into the morning hours, provide extended periods during which supernatural activity is believed to be possible. The cold weather, which keeps families confined indoors for extended periods, has created a hothouse atmosphere where fears and suspicions can intensify and spread rapidly through the community. The agricultural calendar, which normally provides structure and purpose to rural communities like Salem Village, has been disrupted by the ongoing legal proceedings and community crisis. The uncertainty about which community members might be accused of witchcraft and the time required for legal proceedings has made it difficult for families to plan their work and activities. This disruption of normal routines has created additional stress that affects sleep patterns and contributes to the overall sense of instability in the community. The communication networks that connect Salem Village to the broader world have been affected by the witch trials, creating a sense of isolation that intensifies during the nighttime hours. The roads that normally bring news, visitors, and commercial activity to the village have become associated with the transport of accused witches, court officials, and other figures connected to the legal proceedings. This has created a sense that the community is cut off from normal life and trapped in a supernatural crisis that has no clear resolution. The religious practices that traditionally provided comfort and structure to the community have been complicated by the supernatural explanations that have become prevalent. Prayer meetings, which once offered opportunities for communal worship and mutual support, now become occasions for discussing supernatural events and identifying potential threats. The nighttime hours, which had traditionally been associated with private prayer and personal reflection, have been transformed into periods of anxiety and vigilance. The children's games and activities that once provided innocent entertainment have been affected by the adult preoccupations with witchcraft and supernatural threats. Traditional games that involved hiding, role-playing, or imaginative activities are now viewed with suspicion, as parents worried that such activities might provide opportunities for supernatural influence or might be misinterpreted as evidence of witchcraft involvement. The domestic animals that share the lives of Salem Village residents have become subjects of increased attention and concern. Cats, dogs, and other pets that once provided companionship and practical assistance are now viewed as potential familiars or supernatural agents. The nighttime activities of these animals, their movements, sounds, and behaviors are interpreted through the lens of supernatural suspicion, adding another layer of complexity to the community's anxiety about nighttime hours. As you observe the transformation of Salem Village during the winter of 1692, you begin to understand how the witch trials have created a new form of community experience where the traditional boundaries between public and private, natural and supernatural, innocent and guilty have become blurred. The nighttime hours, which had once provided rest and recovery from the day's activities, have become periods of heightened anxiety and vigilance that affect every aspect of community life. But how do these community-wide anxieties manifest in the specific experiences of individual families? What happens when the fear of witchcraft enters the most intimate spaces of domestic life, transforming bedrooms from places of rest into sites of potential supernatural encounter? As darkness falls over Salem Village, you enter the interior world of a typical colonial household where the witch trials have transformed the most intimate spaces of family life. The bedroom, once a sanctuary of rest and privacy, has become a site of potential supernatural encounter where every shadow, every sound, and every dream carries the possibility of witchcraft. The fear that has gripped the community now penetrates the very spaces where families seek refuge from the outside world, creating a form of domestic terror that affects every aspect of household life. The Putnam household, one of the most prominent families in Salem Village and among the most vocal accusers during the witch trials, exemplifies how supernatural fears have invaded domestic spaces. Anne Putnam Sr., the family matriarch, finds her nights filled with spectral encounters that blur the boundaries between dreams and waking experiences. She reports seeing the apparitions of accused witches entering her bedroom, approaching her bed, and attempting to harm her while she sleeps. These encounters, which she describes in vivid detail to court officials, have transformed her bedroom from a place of rest into a battleground between supernatural forces. The sleeping arrangements in colonial households, which typically involve multiple family members sharing beds or sleeping in close proximity, have become complicated by fears of supernatural transmission. Parents worry that spectral attacks on one family member might spread to others, leading to increased vigilance. During the nighttime hours, the practice of children sleeping with their parents. Once a practical arrangement for warmth and security, now carries the additional burden of protecting young ones from supernatural influence. The physical layout of colonial bedrooms has taken on new significance in the context of witch trials. The placement of beds, the arrangement of furniture, and the positioning of windows and doors are now considered in relation to their potential for supernatural access. Some families have begun rearranging their sleeping spaces to minimize the possibility of spectral visitation, while others have adopted protective rituals and objects that they believe might ward off supernatural attacks. The children of Salem Village, who had once found bedtime to be a peaceful conclusion to their daily activities, now approach sleep with a mixture of exhaustion and apprehension. The adult conversations they overhear during the day, discussions of spectral attacks, supernatural encounters, and the identification of witches among their neighbors infiltrate their dreams and create nightmares that wake them crying and fearful. Parents find themselves spending more time at their children's bedsides, offering comfort and reassurance while struggling with their own doubts about their ability to protect their families from supernatural threats. The seasonal cycle of winter in New England has intensified the impact of supernatural fears on household life. The long nights, which begin in mid-afternoon and extend well into the morning hours, provide extended periods during which supernatural activity is believed to be possible. The cold weather, which keeps families confined indoors for extended periods, has created a hothouse atmosphere where fears and suspicions can intensify and spread rapidly through the household. The domestic animals that share the lives of Salem Village families have become subjects of increased attention and concern. Cats, dogs, and other pets that once provided companionship and practical assistance are now viewed as potential familiars or supernatural agents. The nighttime activities of these animals, their movements, sounds, and behaviors are interpreted through the lens of supernatural suspicion, adding another layer of complexity to the household's anxiety about nighttime hours. The household economy, which depends on the productive labor of all family members, has been disrupted by the sleep disturbances and psychological stress associated with the witch trials. The chronic exhaustion that results from poor sleep quality affects the ability of household members to perform their daily tasks. While the time spent discussing supernatural events and providing comfort to fearful family members reduces the hours available for productive work, the religious practices that had traditionally provided structure and comfort to household life have been complicated by the supernatural explanations that have become prevalent. Family prayers, which once offered opportunities for communal worship and mutual support, now become occasions for discussing supernatural events and identifying potential threats. The nighttime hours, which had traditionally been associated with private prayer and personal reflection, have been transformed into periods of anxiety and vigilance. The medical understanding of sleep and dreams, which in colonial America was limited and often intertwined with religious and supernatural explanations, has been further complicated by the witch trials. Nightmares, sleep disturbances, and other sleep-related phenomena are now interpreted as potential evidence of supernatural attack rather than natural physiological processes. This has created a situation where normal sleep experiences are viewed through the lens of supernatural suspicion. Adding to the overall anxiety about nighttime hours, the social networks that connect Salem Village households have been affected by the supernatural fears that now permeate domestic life. Neighbors who once visited freely and shared domestic concerns now approach each other with suspicion, wondering whether their friends and relatives might be involved in witchcraft. The nighttime hours, which had once provided opportunities for social visiting and mutual support, have become periods of isolation and fear. The material culture of Salem Village households has been affected by the supernatural concerns that now dominate domestic life. Objects that once provided comfort and familiarity, mirrors, books, tools, and personal possessions, are now viewed with suspicion as potential instruments of supernatural influence. The nighttime hours, when these objects are less visible and their shadows more pronounced, become periods of heightened anxiety about their potential supernatural significance. The gender dynamics within Salem Village households have been complicated by the supernatural fears that now permeate domestic life. Women who are disproportionately represented among both the accused and the accusers in the witch trials find their traditional roles as domestic managers and caregivers complicated by suspicions about their potential involvement in supernatural activities. The nighttime hours, when women's domestic responsibilities continue but their activities are less visible to the broader community, become periods of particular vulnerability to supernatural suspicion. The generational relationships within Salem Village households have been affected by the supernatural fears that now dominate domestic life. Older family members, who had previously served as sources of wisdom and comfort, now find themselves viewed with suspicion as potential sources of supernatural knowledge. The nighttime hours, when traditional stories and family histories are shared, become opportunities for younger family members to scrutinize their elders for signs of supernatural involvement. The economic relationships that connect Salem Village households to the broader community have been disrupted by the supernatural fears that now permeate domestic life. The trust that once characterized business relationships and commercial transactions has been replaced by suspicion and anxiety about the potential supernatural motivations of trading partners and business associates. The nighttime hours, when accounts are settled and business plans are discussed, become periods of increased anxiety about the supernatural implications of economic relationships, as you observe the transformation of domestic life in Salem Village. During the winter of 1692, you begin to understand how the witch trials have created a new form of household experience where the traditional boundaries between public and private, natural and supernatural, innocent and guilty have become blurred. The nighttime hours, which had once provided rest and recovery from the day's activities, have become periods of heightened anxiety and vigilance that affect every aspect of domestic life. But how do these householdly anxieties manifest in the specific? Experiences of community members who find themselves called upon to serve as witnesses, judges, and participants in the legal proceedings. What happens when the fear of witchcraft transforms ordinary citizens into reluctant participants in a system of supernatural justice that demands constant vigilance and moral judgment? The final phase of community disruption during the Salem witch trials manifests in the experiences of those who find themselves drawn into the legal and social machinery of supernatural justice. As you observe the lives of judges, witnesses, and community leaders during the winter and spring of 1692, you discover how the obligation to participate in witch trials creates a form of civic insomnia that affects not just individual participants, but the entire social fabric of Salem Village. The nighttime hours become periods of moral wrestling, legal preparation, and spiritual examination that transform ordinary citizens into reluctant agents of supernatural justice. The magistrates and judges who preside over the witch trials find their nights filled with the weighty responsibility of distinguishing between innocent and guilty, natural and supernatural, truth and deception. William Stoughton, the Chief Justice of the Court of Oyer and Terminer, spends his evenings reviewing testimony, examining evidence, and wrestling with the theological and legal implications of spectral evidence. The pressure of making life and death decisions based on supernatural testimony creates a form of judicial insomnia that affects his ability to rest and recover from the day's proceedings. The witnesses who are called to testify in witch trials face their own unique burden during the nighttime hours. These individuals, who may have been friends, neighbors, or relatives of the accused, find themselves in the position of providing testimony that could lead to their acquaintance's execution. The moral complexity of this situation creates a form of ethical insomnia that affects the final phase of community disruption during the Salem witch trials. manifests in the experiences of those who find themselves drawn into the legal and social machinery of supernatural justice. As you observe the lives of judges, witnesses, and community leaders during the winter and spring of 1692, you discover how the obligation to participate in witch trials creates a form of civic insomnia that affects not just individual participants, but the entire social fabric of Salem Village. The nighttime hours become periods of moral wrestling, legal preparation, spiritual examination that transforms ordinary citizens into reluctant agents of supernatural justice. The magistrates and judges who preside over the witch trials find their nights filled with the weighty responsibility of distinguishing between innocent and guilty, natural and supernatural, truth and deception. William Stoughton, the Chief Justice of the Courts of Oyer and Terminor, spends his evenings reviewing testimony, examining evidence, and wrestling with the theological and legal implications of spectral evidence. The pressure of making life and death decisions based on supernatural testimony creates a form of judicial insomnia that affects his ability to rest and recover from the day's proceedings. The witnesses who are called to testify in witch trials face their own unique burden during the nighttime hours. These individuals, who may have been friends, neighbors, or relatives of the accused, find themselves in the position of providing testimony that could lead to their acquaintance's execution. The moral complexity of this situation creates a form of ethical insomnia that keeps them awake, reviewing their observations, questioning their perceptions, and struggling with the consequences of their testimony. The ministers and religious leaders who provide spiritual guidance during the witch trials experience their own form of clerical sleeplessness. Cotton Mather, the prominent Puritan minister who supports the trials while expressing occasional doubts about their methods, spends his nights in prayer, study, and theological reflection. The responsibility of providing religious justification for legal proceedings that result in executions weighs heavily on these spiritual leaders, creating a burden that follows them into their private hours. The community members who serve as guards, constables, and other officials in the witch trial proceedings find their sleep disrupted by the practical demands of their roles. These individuals must transport prisoners, maintain security during court sessions, and oversee the detention of accused witches. The irregular schedules and emotional stress associated with these duties create a form of occupational insomnia that affects their ability to maintain normal sleep patterns. The families of court officials and community leaders experience their own form of secondary insomnia as they witness the toll that participation in witch trials takes on their loved ones. Wives of judges and ministers find themselves lying awake, listening to their husbands' restless sleep, serving their struggles with the moral and practical challenges of the trials, and worrying about the long-term consequences of their involvement in supernatural justice. The economic disruption caused by the witch trials creates a form of financial insomnia that affects merchants, farmers, and craftsmen throughout Salem Village. The uncertainty about which community members might be accused next, combined with the practical costs of legal proceedings and the disruption of normal commercial relationships, creates anxiety about economic survival that keeps business owners awake, calculating losses and planning for an uncertain future. The seasonal agricultural cycle, which normally provides structure and predictability to rural life, has been disrupted by the legal proceedings and community crisis. Farmers who should be preparing for spring planting find themselves preoccupied with court appearances, testimony preparation, and the general disruption of community life. The anxiety about whether they will be able to complete seasonal work creates a form of agricultural insomnia that compounds the other stresses affecting the community. The communication networks that connect Salem Village to the broader colonial world have been overwhelmed by the witch trials, creating information overload that affects sleep patterns throughout the community. Letters, reports, and visitors bring constant updates about the trials, creating a 24-hour cycle of news and speculation that prevents normal rest. Community members find themselves staying awake late into the night discussing the latest developments and their implications for local and regional politics. The children and young people of Salem Village, who are both victims and perpetrators of supernatural accusations, experience their own form of developmental insomnia. These individuals, thrust into adult roles as witnesses and accusers, struggle with the psychological burden of their participation in legal proceedings that result in executions, the conflict between their natural development and the adult responsibilities they have assumed creates sleep disturbances that affect their physical and emotional growth. The documentation requirements of the witch trials create a form of bureaucratic insomnia that affects clerks, scribes, and other officials responsible for maintaining court records. The need to accurately record testimony, preserve evidence, and maintain legal documentation requires extended hours of careful work that disrupts normal sleep schedules. The pressure to maintain accurate records in cases that will determine life and death creates additional stress that interferes with rest. The theological debates generated by the witch trials create a form of intellectual insomnia among educated community members who struggle to reconcile their religious beliefs with the events they are witnessing. The questions raised by spectral evidence, the nature of supernatural intervention in human affairs, and the proper response to alleged witchcraft create complex philosophical problems that occupy the minds of thoughtful individuals during the nighttime hours. The social surveillance that has become necessary during the witch trials creates a form of communal insomnia that affects the entire village. Community members feel obligated to watch their neighbors for signs of supernatural activity, to report unusual behavior, and to maintain constant vigilance against potential threats. This heightened state of alert prevents normal relaxation and rest, creating a community-wide condition of chronic sleep deprivation. The legal precedents being established by the Salem witch trials create anxiety among legal professionals and educated community members who understand the broader implications of the proceedings. The acceptance of spectral evidence, the use of confession evidence obtained under duress, and the expansion of witchcraft law create concerns about the future of colonial justice that keep legal scholars and political leaders awake, analyzing the long-term consequences. The regional and international attention focused on the Salem witch trials creates pressure on community leaders to justify their actions to outside observers. The knowledge that their proceedings are being watched and evaluated by authorities in Boston, London, and other centers of power creates a form of political insomnia that affects those responsible for conducting the trials. The gradual recognition that the witch trials may have resulted in the execution of innocent people creates a form of collective guilt that begins to affect the sleep of community members who supported or participated in the proceedings. As doubt creeps into the community consciousness, individuals who had previously felt certain about the righteousness of their cause begin to experience anxiety and regret that interferes with their rest. The economic costs of the witch trials, which include not only direct legal expenses but also the broader disruption of community life, create long-term financial concerns that affect sleep throughout Salem Village. The recognition that the community has invested enormous resources in proceedings that may have been based on false premises creates anxiety about economic recovery that keeps business leaders and property owners awake, planning for an uncertain future. The social relationships that had provided structure and support to Salem Village life have been fundamentally altered by the witch trials, creating a form of social insomnia that affects community members' ability to find comfort in traditional sources of support. Friends and relatives who once provided emotional security are now viewed with suspicion, creating isolation and anxiety that interferes with rest. As the witch trials begin to wind down in late 1692 and early 1693, the community of Salem Village faces the challenge of rebuilding social relationships and restoring normal life patterns. The process of reconciliation and recovery creates its own form of transitional insomnia as community members struggle to reintegrate neighbors who were accused, families who were divided, and institutions that were damaged by the supernatural. Crisis, the long-term psychological impact of the witch trials, creates a form of historical insomnia that will affect Salem Village for generations to come. The knowledge that their community participated in legal proceedings that resulted in the execution of 20 people based on supernatural evidence creates a collective trauma that influences sleep patterns, social relationships, and community identity for decades after the immediate crisis has passed. As you observe the final phase of community disruption during the Salem witch trials, you begin to understand how the systematic pursuit of supernatural justice created a form of civic exhaustion that affected every aspect of village life. The nighttime hours, which had once provided rest and recovery from daily activities, became periods of moral wrestling, legal preparation, and social surveillance that transformed an entire community into reluctant participants in a system of supernatural justice. The legacy of these sleepless nights would persist long after the witch trials themselves had ended, creating patterns of anxiety, suspicion, and social dysfunction that would influence Salem Village for generations to come. The community's experience demonstrates how the pursuit of supernatural justice can create forms of collective insomnia that undermine the very social bonds and institutions that such justice claims to protect. You find yourself in the courtroom of early modern England, where the boundary between sleeping and waking experience has become a matter of legal significance. Here, in an environment where dreams, nightmares, and spectral encounters serve as evidence in criminal proceedings, you witness how the most private and vulnerable moments of human consciousness have been transformed into public testimony. The phenomenon known as spectral evidence, testimony about supernatural encounters experienced during sleep or altered states of consciousness, represents one of the most disturbing aspects of witch trials, where the invasion of privacy extends beyond the physical realm into the very landscape of dreams and nighttime visions. The legal foundation for accepting spectral evidence in witch trials rests on the belief that accused witches could send out their spiritual forms to torment victims while their physical bodies remained elsewhere. This doctrine, supported by religious authorities and legal scholars throughout Europe and colonial America, created a form of supernatural jurisprudence, where the traditional rules of evidence were suspended in favor of testimony about otherworldly encounters. The victims who provided spectral evidence typically described encounters that occurred during the liminal state between sleeping and waking, when consciousness is most vulnerable to suggestion and misinterpretation. These witnesses would report that the spectral forms of accused witches had visited them during the night, appearing at their bedsides, pressing down upon their chests, or engaging in conversations that seemed as real as any waking interaction. The vivid nature of these experiences, combined with the genuine terror they inspired, made them compelling testimony in legal proceedings where supernatural explanations were accepted as valid. The phenomenon, now understood as sleep paralysis, provided much of the foundation for spectral evidence in witch trials. This neurological condition, which occurs when consciousness returns before the body's natural sleep paralysis mechanism releases, creates the sensation of being unable to move while remaining aware of one's surroundings. The terrifying nature of this experience, often accompanied by hallucinations of threatening figures, provided a physiological basis for encounters that were interpreted as supernatural attacks. The cultural context of early modern Europe and colonial America provided a framework for interpreting sleep paralysis and related phenomena as evidence of witchcraft. The religious belief in the reality of supernatural forces, combined with folk traditions about night-visiting spirits and demonic attacks, created an interpretive system where unusual sleep experiences were automatically understood in supernatural terms. The medical knowledge of the time, which had little understanding of neurological conditions or sleep disorders, offered no alternative explanations for these phenomena. The legal procedures for collecting and evaluating spectral evidence were carefully developed to address the unique challenges of supernatural testimony. Witnesses were questioned about the specific details of their encounters, the appearance of the spectral figures, the time and location of the attacks, the words spoken during the encounters, and the physical sensations experienced. Interrogations were designed to establish the credibility of the testimony and to identify specific individuals who could be accused of witchcraft based on their alleged spectral activities. The psychological impact of providing spectral evidence was profound for both witnesses and the broader community. Individuals who reported supernatural encounters found themselves thrust into public prominence as key witnesses in legal proceedings that could result in executions. The pressure to provide convincing testimony, combined with the genuine terror of their experiences, created a psychological burden that affected their sleep patterns, social relationships, and overall mental health. The young women who served as the primary spectral witnesses in the Salem witch trials exemplified the complex psychological dynamics involved in supernatural testimony. Abigail Williams, Betty Paris, and the other afflicted girls reported numerous encounters with the spectral forms of accused witches, describing attacks that occurred during both sleeping and waking hours. Their testimony, delivered with apparent sincerity and accompanied by physical manifestations of distress, provided the foundation for dozens of accusations and multiple executions. The training and preparation of spectral witnesses involved both formal and informal education about the nature of supernatural encounters and the proper way to report them. Ministers, magistrates, and other authorities would guide witnesses through the process of bruchess, of understanding their experiences and translating them into legally useful testimony. This guidance often involved leading questions that suggested specific interpretations of ambiguous experiences, transforming personal nightmares into evidence of criminal activity. The corroboration of spectral evidence often involved multiple witnesses reporting similar encounters with the same accused witch. These parallel testimonies, which seemed to confirm the reality of supernatural attacks, were actually often the result of suggestion, shared cultural expectations, and the influence of community discussion about supernatural threats. The apparent independence of multiple witnesses reporting similar spectral encounters created a compelling narrative that supported the prosecution of accused witches. The defense against spectral evidence proved extremely difficult within the legal and theological framework of early modern witch trials. The accused could not provide alibis for their spectral activities, as their physical bodies might have been present in one location while their spiritual forms were allegedly attacking victims elsewhere. The inability to disprove spectral attacks created a legal situation where accusation was tantamount to conviction, as the only evidence required was the testimony of alleged victims. The theological implications of spectral evidence created complex debates among religious authorities about the nature of supernatural intervention in human affairs. Some ministers argued that God would not allow the devil to impersonate innocent people in spectral form, making all spectral evidence reliable. Others contended that the devil was capable of such deception, making spectral evidence inherently unreliable. These theological debates had direct legal consequences, as they influenced the admissibility and weight given to supernatural testimony. The documentation of spectral evidence required careful attention to detail and specific language that would capture the supernatural nature of the encounters while maintaining legal credibility. Court scribes developed specialized vocabulary and procedures for recording testimony about otherworldly events, creating a body of legal documentation that reveals the systematic nature of supernatural jurisprudence during the witch trial period. The social impact of spectral evidence extended far beyond the immediate participants in witch trials. The knowledge that dreams and nightmares could serve as evidence in criminal proceedings created a climate where the most private experiences of consciousness became matters of public concern. Community members began to scrutinize their own sleep experiences for signs of supernatural attack, while simultaneously wondering whether their own dreams might implicate them in witchcraft accusations. The gender dynamics of spectral evidence reflected broader patterns in which trial prosecutions, with women serving as both the primary witnesses and the primary targets of supernatural accusations. The cultural association between women and supernatural knowledge, combined with social tensions about female authority and independence, created a context where women's sleep experiences were both valorized as sources of supernatural insight and demonized as evidence of supernatural corruption. The economic implications of spectral evidence were significant. As communities invested substantial resources in legal proceedings based on supernatural testimony, the costs of conducting trials, maintaining prisoners, and executing convicted witches created financial burdens that affected entire regions. The economic incentives for witch hunters and legal officials also created systematic pressures to accept spectral evidence and pursue supernatural prosecutions. The international exchange of information about spectral evidence and supernatural jurisprudence created a network of legal and theological authorities who shared techniques for identifying, documenting, and prosecuting supernatural crimes. This international dialogue helped standardize the procedures for collecting spectral evidence and created a body of legal precedent that influenced witch trials. Across Europe and colonial America, the psychological techniques used to elicit spectral evidence often involved forms of suggestion and manipulation that influenced witnesses' perceptions and memories of their experiences. Interrogators would use leading questions, provide specific details about supernatural encounters, and encourage witnesses to elaborate on ambiguous experiences in ways that supported accusations against particular individuals. The medical understanding of sleep and consciousness during the early modern period provided little foundation for alternative explanations of the phenomena that were interpreted as spectral evidence. The limited knowledge of neurological conditions, sleep disorders, and psychological processes meant that unusual sleep experiences were routinely attributed to supernatural causes rather than natural physiological processes. As you observe the role of spectral evidence in early modern witch trials, you begin to understand how the legal system's acceptance of supernatural testimony created a form of jurisprudence where the most private and vulnerable aspects of human consciousness became matters of public prosecution. The transformation of dreams, nightmares, and altered states of consciousness into legal evidence represents one of the most profound invasions of privacy in legal history, where the boundary between inner experience and outer reality was systematically violated in the service of supernatural justice. But how did the specific experiences of individual witnesses shape the development of spectral evidence as a legal concept? What can we learn from examining the detailed testimony of those who claim to have been attacked by supernatural forces during their sleep? The courtroom in Salem grows quiet as Mercy Lewis, a 17-year-old servant in the household of Thomas Putnam, rises to provide her testimony about the spectral attacks she has endured. Her account, like those of many other witnesses during the witch trials, reveals the intimate details of how supernatural encounters were believed to invade the most private moments of sleep and rest. As you listen to her words, carefully recorded by court scribes, you begin to understand how personal nightmares became public evidence and how the legal system transformed individual terror into collective prosecution. Mercy Lewis describes waking in the darkness of her small attic chamber to find the spectral form of Martha Corey standing at the foot of her bed. The apparition, she testifies, appeared as solid and real as any living person, dressed in the same clothing that Corey wore during daily activities in Salem Village. The specter's eyes, Lewis reports, glowed with an unnatural light, and her mouth moved in whispered words that seemed to come from both near and far simultaneously. This level of detail, typical of spectral evidence testimony, provided courts with specific descriptions that seemed to confirm the reality of supernatural encounters. The physical sensations that accompanied spectral attacks formed a crucial component of witness testimony. Lewis describes feeling an overwhelming weight pressing down upon her chest, making it difficult to breathe and impossible to move her limbs. This paralysis, she explains, felt different from normal sleep because her mind remained fully alert and aware of her surroundings while her body refused to respond to her will. The terror of being conscious but helpless created a psychological trauma that would influence her sleep patterns for months after the alleged attack. The temporal aspects of spectral encounters were carefully documented to establish their supernatural nature. Lewis testifies that the attack occurred at precisely midnight, a time traditionally associated with supernatural activity in Puritan culture. The specter remained present for what seemed like hours, though Lewis acknowledges that her sense of time became distorted during the encounter. This temporal confusion, common in sleep paralysis experiences, was interpreted as evidence of the supernatural disruption of normal physical laws, rather than as a natural neurological phenomenon. The communication that allegedly occurred during spectral attacks provided some of the most compelling evidence in witch trials. Lewis reports that Martha Corey's specter spoke to her in a voice that was recognizably. Corey's butt carried an unnatural quality that revealed its supernatural origin. The specter, according to Lewis's testimony, attempted to persuade her to join a community of witches, ascribing supernatural powers and pleasures that would be available to those who abandoned their Christian faith. These conversations, detailed and specific, seem to provide direct evidence of attempted supernatural recruitment. The physical evidence of spectral attacks was often minimal, but carefully documented when it existed. Lewis testifies that she discovered strange marks on her arms and neck the morning after the attack, though these marks disappeared within hours of being observed by other household members. The ephemeral nature of such evidence was explained as part of the supernatural methodology employed by witches to avoid detection, making the absence of permanent physical proof seem like confirmation rather than contradiction of the supernatural explanation. The witnesses called to corroborate spectral evidence often provided testimony about the behavioral changes they observed in alleged victims. Thomas Putnam testifies that Mercy Lewis exhibited unusual behavior for several days following her reported spectral attack, including difficulty sleeping, reluctance to remain alone in her chamber, and episodes of apparent terror that would occur without obvious cause. These behavioral changes, interpreted as evidence of supernatural trauma, provided additional support for the reality of spectral encounters. The comparison of spectral evidence from multiple witnesses created patterns that seemed to confirm the systematic nature of supernatural attacks. Ann Putnam Jr., another young witness, provides testimony that parallels Lewis's account in significant details. The midnight timing, the sensation of paralysis, the attempts at supernatural recruitment. The consistency of these accounts across different witnesses was interpreted as evidence of a coordinated supernatural campaign rather than as the result of shared cultural expectations and mutual influence among the witnesses. The religious context of spectral encounters was emphasized in witness testimony to establish their significance within Puritan theology. Lewis describes how the specter of Martha Corey mocked her prayers and attempted to prevent her from reciting biblical passages that might provide protection. The specter's alleged knowledge of Christian doctrine and its apparent ability to interfere with religious observance was presented as evidence of the serious theological threat posed by supernatural forces operating. In Salem Village, the medical testimony provided by local physicians and healers often supported supernatural interpretations of spectral evidence. Dr. William Griggs, who examined several of the afflicted girls, reported that their symptoms showed no signs of natural illness or injury. The absence of conventional medical explanations for the witnesses' distress was presented as evidence that supernatural causes must be responsible, creating a form of diagnostic reasoning that eliminated natural possibilities in favor of otherworldly explanations. The documentation of spectral evidence required careful attention to language and detail that would capture the supernatural nature of encounters while maintaining legal credibility. Court scribes developed specialized procedures for recording testimony about otherworldly events, including specific questions about the appearance, behavior, and words of spectral figures. This systematic approach to documenting supernatural testimony created a body of legal evidence that could be compared across cases and used to establish patterns of supernatural activity. The cross-examination of spectral witnesses often revealed the complex psychological dynamics involved in supernatural testimony. Defense attorneys would question witnesses about their ability to distinguish between dreams and waking experiences. Their familiarity with local folklore about supernatural encounters, and their relationships with the accused individuals. These examinations sometimes revealed inconsistencies or uncertainties in witness testimony. But such challenges were often dismissed as evidence of the witness's courage in facing supernatural retaliation. The psychological impact of providing spectral evidence was profound for the witnesses themselves, who found their most private and terrifying experiences transformed into public testimony. The process of repeatedly recounting supernatural encounters for legal purposes often intensified the psychological trauma associated with the original experiences, creating a cycle where legal proceedings prolonged and amplified the very suffering they were meant to address. The community response to spectral evidence created a climate where unusual sleep experiences became matters of public concern and potential legal significance. Community members began to scrutinize their own dreams and nightmares for signs of supernatural attack, while simultaneously watching their neighbors for evidence of spectral activity. This heightened awareness of supernatural possibilities created a feedback loop where expectation and suggestion influenced the interpretation of normal sleep phenomena. The theological implications of spectral evidence created ongoing debates among religious authorities about the reliability and significance of supernatural testimony. Some ministers argued that the consistency and detail of spectral evidence proved its divine origin, while others contended that the devil's ability to deceive made all supernatural testimony inherently suspect. These theological discussions had direct impact on legal proceedings, as they influenced judicial attitudes toward the accessibility and weight of spectral evidence. The international context of spectral evidence connected Salem's witch trials to broader European traditions of supernatural jurisprudence. Legal authorities in Massachusetts consulted European precedents for handling spectral evidence and corresponded with continental experts about the proper procedures for evaluating supernatural testimony. This international dialogue helped legitimize the use of spectral evidence while also importing European assumptions about the nature and significance of supernatural encounters. The long-term psychological consequences of spectral evidence testimony affected witnesses for years after the immediate crisis had passed. Many of those who provided supernatural testimony continued to experience sleep disturbances, anxiety about nighttime hours, and difficulty distinguishing between natural and supernatural explanations for unusual experiences. The process of having their most private terrors validated as legal evidence created lasting changes in their relationship with sleep, privacy, and personal autonomy. The economic dimensions of spectral evidence included both the costs of legal proceedings and the broader social disruption caused by supernatural accusations. Communities invested substantial resources in trials based on spectral testimony, while the social networks of trust and cooperation that supported economic activity were damaged by suspicions of supernatural malevolence among community members. As you observe the detailed testimony provided by spectral witnesses during the Salem witch trials, you begin to understand how the legal system's acceptance of supernatural evidence created a form of jurisprudence where private terror became public prosecution. The transformation of individual nightmares into collective legal action represents one of the most profound examples of how cultural beliefs about the supernatural can reshape fundamental assumptions about evidence, truth, and justice. But what were the long-term consequences of accepting spectral evidence as legitimate testimony? How did the systematic documentation of supernatural encounters influence not only immediate legal proceedings, but also broader cultural understanding of sleep, consciousness, and the relationship between private experience and public authority? The gradual recognition that spectral evidence might be unreliable marked a turning point not only in the Salem witch trials, but in the broader understanding of consciousness, evidence, and the relationship between private experience and public justice. As you observe the final phases of the witch trial period, you witness how the systematic acceptance of supernatural testimony ultimately led to its own undoing, creating legal and cultural precedents that would influence Western jurisprudence for centuries to come. The first serious challenges to spectral evidence emerged from within the religious community that had initially supported its use. Increase Mather, the prominent Puritan minister and father of Cotton Mather, published Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits in October 1692, arguing that spectral evidence was inherently unreliable because the devil could assume the appearance of innocent people. This theological argument, supported by 14 other ministers, created the foundation for legal challenges to supernatural testimony that would ultimately lead to the end of the Salem witch trials. The practical problems associated with spectral evidence became increasingly apparent as the witch trials progressed and the number of accusations multiplied. The system of supernatural justice that had initially seemed to provide clear distinctions between innocent and guilty began to break down as accusations spread to include respected community leaders, ministers, wives, and even the governor's wife. The realization that spectral evidence could be used to accuse anyone, regardless of their social standing or moral reputation, forced authorities to reconsider the reliability of supernatural testimony. The psychological understanding of spectral encounters began to evolve as medical knowledge expanded and alternative explanations for unusual sleep experiences became available. Physicians and natural philosophers began to propose that the phenomena interpreted as spectral attacks might result from natural causes such as melancholy, hysteria, or disorders of the imagination. These alternative explanations, while still limited by the medical knowledge of the time, provided competing frameworks for understanding experiences that had previously been attributed exclusively to supernatural causes. The legal reforms that followed the Salem witch trials included specific provisions limiting the use of spectral evidence in criminal proceedings. The Massachusetts legislature passed laws requiring corroborating evidence for supernatural testimony and establishing higher standards of proof. For witchcraft accusations, these legal changes reflected a broader shift toward empirical standards of evidence that would influence the development of modern legal systems. The cultural impact of the spectral evidence controversy extended far beyond the immediate context of witch trials. The recognition that private experiences could be manipulated, misinterpreted, or deliberately falsified had implications for understanding memory, testimony, and the relationship between individual consciousness and social authority. The Salem witch trials became a cautionary tale about the dangers of accepting uncorroborated personal testimony as the basis for legal action. The documentation of spectral evidence created an extensive archive of supernatural testimony that would be studied and reinterpreted by subsequent generations of scholars, legal authorities, and medical professionals. These records provided unique insights into early modern understanding of consciousness, sleep, and supernatural belief, while also serving as evidence of the dangers inherent in legal systems that abandon empirical standards of proof. The economic consequences of the witch trials, including the substantial costs of legal proceedings based on spectral evidence, led to more careful consideration of the resources required for supernatural prosecutions. Communities that had invested heavily in witch trials found themselves questioning whether the results justified the expense, creating economic incentives for more cautious approaches to supernatural accusations. The social reconciliation that followed the Salem witch trials required communities to address the damage caused by accepting spectral evidence as legitimate testimony. Families that had been divided by supernatural accusations, neighbors who had been turned against each other by spectral testimony, and communities that had been torn apart by witch trials needed to find ways to rebuild trust and cooperation. This process of reconciliation often involved implicit or explicit recognition that spectral evidence had been unreliable. The international impact of the Salem witch trials and the spectral evidence controversy influenced witch trial practices throughout Europe and other colonial territories. The Massachusetts experience provided a cautionary example of how supernatural testimony could lead to judicial excess, contributing to the broader decline of witch prosecutions in the Western world. The theological legacy of the spectral evidence debate continued to influence religious thought long after the witch trials had ended. The questions raised about the devil's ability to deceive human perception, the reliability of supernatural revelation, and the proper relationship between religious belief and legal evidence became important themes in Protestant theology and influenced the development of more skeptical approaches to supernatural claims. The psychological insights gained from studying spectral evidence contributed to early understanding of phenomena such as sleep paralysis, hallucinations, and the influence of suggestion on memory and perception. While the medical knowledge of the time was limited, the detailed documentation of spectral encounters provided valuable data for later researchers. Studying consciousness and sleep disorders, the literary and cultural influence of spectral evidence extended into popular culture, where accounts of supernatural encounters during the Salem witch trials became the basis for numerous works of fiction, drama, and historical analysis. These cultural productions often focused on the psychological and social dynamics involved in spectral testimony, exploring themes of truth, deception, and the power of belief to shape perception. The feminist interpretation of spectral evidence has highlighted the role of gender in supernatural testimony, noting that women served as both the primary witnesses and the primary targets of spectral accusations. This analysis has revealed how spectral evidence reflected and reinforced social tensions about female authority, independence, and sexuality, providing insights into the intersection of gender and supernatural belief in early modern society. The legal scholarship surrounding spectral evidence has contributed to broader understanding of evidence, its testimony, and the standards of proof required for criminal conviction. The Salem witch trials have become a standard case study in law schools and legal education, illustrating the importance of empirical evidence and the dangers of accepting uncorroborated personal testimony as the basis for legal action. The medical understanding of the phenomena that were interpreted as spectral evidence has advanced significantly since the early modern period. Modern sleep research has identified sleep paralysis, hypnagogic hallucinations, and other neurological phenomena that can create experiences similar to those described in spectral evidence testimony. This scientific understanding has provided alternative explanations for supernatural encounters that were once attributed exclusively to otherworldly causes. The historical memory of spectral evidence and the Salem witch trials has been shaped by ongoing debates about the nature of evidence, truth, and justice in American society. The witch trials have become a symbol of the dangers of moral panic, mass hysteria, and the abandonment of due process. Referenced in discussions of everything from McCarthyism to contemporary controversies about false accusations and recovered memory, the archival preservation of spectral evidence. Testimony has created a unique historical resource for understanding early modern consciousness, belief, and legal practice. The detailed records of supernatural encounters, while originally created for legal purposes, now serve as valuable sources for historians, anthropologists, and psychologists studying the intersection of culture, consciousness, and social authority. The educational legacy of the spectral evidence controversy continues to influence how the Salem witch trials are taught and understood in American schools and universities. The recognition that spectral testimony was unreliable has become a standard element in discussions of critical thinking, evidence evaluation, and the importance of skeptical inquiry in both academic and practical contexts. As you contemplate the long-term legacy of spectral evidence and its role in the Salem witch trials, you begin to understand how the systematic acceptance of supernatural testimony represented both a culmination of early modern beliefs about consciousness and the supernatural, and a turning point toward more empirical approaches to evidence and justice. The recognition that private experiences of sleep and consciousness could be unreliable sources of legal evidence marked an important step in the development of modern standards of proof and the protection of individual rights against mass hysteria and social panic. The transformation of spectral evidence from accepted legal testimony to historical cautionary tale reflects broader changes in Western culture's understanding of consciousness, evidence, and the proper relationship between individual, experience, and social authority. The Salem witch trials and the spectral evidence controversy continue to serve as important reminders of the need for rigorous standards of evidence and the protection of individual rights against the pressures of collective fear and supernatural belief. The ultimate legacy of spectral evidence lies not in its supernatural content, but in its demonstration of how cultural beliefs about consciousness and the otherworldly can reshape fundamental assumptions about truth, justice, and the nature of evidence itself. The detailed documentation of supernatural encounters during the Salem witch trials provides a unique window into early modern consciousness, while also serving as a powerful reminder of the importance of empirical standards and critical thinking in both legal and social contexts. As dawn breaks over Salem Village in May 1693, marking the end of the most intensive period of witch trials in colonial American history, you witness a community slowly awakening from a nightmare that had consumed their lives for over a year. The empty jail cells, the quiet courtrooms, the gradual return to normal sleep patterns mark not just the end of a legal crisis, but the beginning of a long process of understanding how the most basic human need for rest had been weaponized, manipulated, and transformed into evidence of supernatural crime. The 20 individuals who lost their lives during the Salem witch trials were victims not just of superstition and fear, but of a systematic assault on human consciousness that began with the denial of sleep and ended with the acceptance of dreams as evidence of guilt. Their deaths serve as a stark reminder of how the boundaries between sleeping and waking, private and public, natural and supernatural, can be manipulated by those in power to serve their own ends. The legacy of these events extends far beyond the immediate context of witch trials, providing insights into the fundamental relationship between sleep, consciousness, and human vulnerability that remain relevant today. The recognition that sleep deprivation can be used as a tool of torture, that dreams and nightmares can be influenced by suggestion and expectation, and that private experiences of consciousness can be manipulated for public purposes, continues to inform our understanding of human rights, legal evidence, and the protection of individual dignity. As you reflect on these 4 stories of sleep during the 1600s witch trials, you are left with profound questions about the nature of justice, the reliability of consciousness, and the eternal human struggle for rest in a world where even our dreams may not be private. The boring details of daily life, the straw bedding, the cold floors, the disrupted sleep patterns, and the gradual exhaustion of entire communities reveal themselves to be the building blocks of one of history's most profound examinations of human nature under extreme pressure. In the end, the witch trials of the 1600s teach us that sleep, far from being a simple biological necessity, exists at the intersection of the most fundamental questions about human existence: the nature of consciousness, the boundaries of privacy, the reliability of memory, and the eternal struggle between individual rights and collective fear. The boring history of how people slept during witch trials becomes, ultimately, a fascinating exploration of what it means to be human in a world where even our most private moments are never truly safe from the scrutiny of others.